Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa suffered a painful-looking rib injury on this play, and in this video, we'll break down exactly what could have happened here. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. If you enjoy learning about sports injuries, then be sure you're subscribed because we're going to be covering stuff all football season, basketball upcoming, and every other sport. This was the play where Tua was injured, and there was really not much, I don't think, on the hit itself. It was really more when Tua was driven into the ground here. And the Bills defender didn't even really fall on him. I think it was more just the force that Tua hit the ground with, landing kind of on that left side, a little bit more on the upper back part of his back. As Tua's trying to get up here, we can see he's kind of grabbing at that lower portion of his left rib cage, kind of the left anterior chest. And so it made sense when we heard about the report of a rib injury. If we look at our biodigital anatomy tool, when we hear about a rib injury, of course, the big thing we're going to think of initially is a rib fracture. But it's important to remember with these injuries that there's a lot of other anatomy and other things that can be injured when somebody has just an impact to the chest or the thorax, like Tua had on this play. We have 12 pairs of ribs, and the first, the second, and the third are the least likely to be fractured, just based on their position in the chest and the higher amount of force that's needed to fracture them. And then all the way down at the bottom, ribs 11 and 12 are what we call floating ribs. You can see how the front or anterior portion of the rib is not directly attached to anything. Because they're floating, they're more mobile, and so when they take force, they can bend and move more than have that energy transmitted through the bone and cause a fracture. So really the ones that are most common are going to be ribs 4 through 10. So rib fracture definitely on the differential. The problem though is that unless it's a severe displaced, meaning the bones are out of alignment rib fracture, you're probably not going to see anything on the x-ray. You're going to have to rely on your clinical exam. Maybe have ultrasound there in the locker room to help look for a fracture, but at the game, unless it's a severe fracture, you're really going more off of your physical exam. Other things to think of though with a rib injury, of course, is a pneumothorax or collapsed lung. You can see the lungs sit right behind the ribs, and depending on if that rib fracture leads to any trauma in that lining surrounding the lung, you can lose that vacuum space in there, air accumulates and the lung collapses. That's going to definitely be a no return to play sort of situation. Other things to think of in this area, if we look below the diaphragm, we of course have the spleen that sits on the left side of the upper abdomen, kind of near that area where Tua was grabbing. And so it's not just the rib injuries. We have to look for possible signs of organ damage, organ injuries. The kidneys sit back up here. And so we have to make sure we look beyond just the bones whenever we have chest trauma like this. With our anatomy in mind, let's look back at the play one more time. Tua gets hit, and it's not going to be the initial contact on this hit here. It's going to be when Tua comes to the ground. That force of the ground pushing upwards on the backside of his ribs combined with the downward force in the front is potentially going to cause those ribs to break, but we also have to think about injuries to the organs, the lungs, and the other structures that sit deeper behind the ribs. When we look at where Tua is grabbing down lower on the ribs, that's going to also make us think more about these other things like the spleen, the kidneys, potentially being injured from the rib impact. If this turns out to be a rib fracture, they typically don't require surgery, and often players are able to get back on the field within a few weeks, and it's purely a matter of when their pain resolves. You don't have to have full healing of the fracture. It's just once they're no longer having soreness there, they can breathe comfortably without pain, and they can do their football activities, that you let them return. Now, if we have something like a spleen, a lung injury, or anything with the organs, that's going to be a longer recovery process. Key learning point to take away here, we have 12 pairs of ribs on each side of the chest. Ribs 1, 2, and 3 are going to be the least likely to be fractured, including the ones down at the bottom, ribs 11 and 12, because they're floating ribs where the front end is not attached to any bone. That leaves ribs kind of 4 through 10 to be the most susceptible, and beyond just the rib fracture, we have other structures like the cartilage joint here with the ribs, the lungs, the spleen, the kidneys that can also be injured when we have blunt trauma to the chest. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.